And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm meteorologist Peter Chan with the National Weather Service, and here is your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook. It is Thursday, September 5th, and this outlook will be for Friday and Saturday. But as we start out this particular segment, we always look at the sea ice, and we have a lot of open water here along the Arctic coast, Chukchi Sea coastline in through the Bering Strait. Still some ice there, though, off of the Russian-Siberian coast, and that'll be the case. We're almost nearing the minimum ice extent historically or climatologically speaking. It usually occurs right around the third week of September. And looking at what we have on the weather map, there's a weaker secondary low that'll develop late tonight, early Friday morning, along and just east of Kodiak Island. This feature will continue to drift eastward Friday into Saturday and weaken. This weakening occluded front will continue to have some bands of rain and rain showers with it, though not as strong as the initial low that came in to the western Gulf later Wednesday night into Thursday morning. Back to the west, there's the hint of the next stronger system. This is a strong front that'll work its way quickly across the Bering Sea on Friday and is expected to make landfall along the west coast Saturday afternoon and evening. We have a weaker area of low pressure there over the western Gulf for Friday afternoon, and then by the time we get into Saturday, that low just slowly fills and works its way eastward. It will have a few lingering lighter showers across areas of the Panhandle, but at least a brief ridging out here through south central will allow for a little drier conditions and a break from the action. This front will have breezy conditions. Could have some winds gusting up around gale force along the coast, which could elevate water levels at high tide, given the increased wind and surf action. So the forecast here, marine weather outlook for the Panhandle: southeast winds 20 knots for the inner channels, gust up to 35 knots within Lynn Canal. Waves generally running 3-4 feet. The outer coast, south to southeast winds right around 20 knots, and swells there 9 to 10 feet. On Saturday, winds will be southeasterly at 10 knots with 2-foot waves for the inner channels. South winds to 10 to 15 knots south of Gustavus. Outside of there, easterly winds outside of Yakutat Bay, Cape Suckling at 15 knots, and generally speaking, seas there about 7 feet. Now, for areas of the northwestern Gulf, look for winds to be southeasterly 15 to 20 knots outside of Hinchinbrook entrance with 8-foot swells. Within Prince William Sound, southeast winds to 20 knots with waves of 3-4 feet. As we go down the length of Cook Inlet, north to northwest winds 20 to 20 knots, becoming more northwesterly there at the entrance with waves 5 to 6 feet. For Saturday, winds will be variable at 10 knots within Prince William Sound, 2-foot waves. We're looking at winds turning more southerly, 15 to 20 knots within Cook Inlet with waves 4 to 5 feet, and variable winds off the Kenai coast at 10 knots. Across Kodiak Island on Friday, westerly winds 20 knots. As we trail down along the Alaska Peninsula, we see winds 20 knots picking back up to northwesterly 25-knot winds there, Cold Bay, False Pass. And waves within Bristol Bay, 3-4 feet, increasing to as high as 9 feet there, just outside of Cold Bay on the north side there, up through the Bering Sea. Variable winds on Saturday around Kodiak Island, only 10 knots with 3 or 4 foot waves. Otherwise, the Alaska Peninsula, generally southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, waves 3 to 4 feet on the North Pacific side and 4 to 5 feet on the Bering side. For the Aleutian chain on Friday, northwest winds over the eastern Aleutians 20 to 25 knots, trying to turn back southwesterly 20 knots, Atka to Adak, and then southerly winds increasing to 30 knots, upwards of 35-knot gales west of Kiska, and that's in response of that front that'll be coming across the Bering Sea, and the Aleutians will just kind of be on the trailing south end of that frontal system. Saturday, winds west-southwest over the eastern Aleutians 25 to 30 knots, all the way back here toward Adak, and then they fall off a little bit, closer to 25 knots from the south and southwest as you get west of Adak. Along the southwest coast, northwest winds to 20 knots within Kuskokwim and Bristol Bay, as well as out toward the Pribilovs. Southwest winds to 25 knots at St. Matthew. But along the lower Yukon coast and in through the wider expanse of Norton Sound. Northerly winds, 25 knots, turning northwesterly on the north side there of Nunavik Island and through Etolin Strait. Waves could be 4 to 5 feet there along the lower Yukon coast and within Norton Sound. And then with that front approaching, you can see the wind ahead of it, southeast to south winds shifting more west-southwest. And winds along with this front could be as high as 30 knots with highest waves in surf action, especially from around the lower Kuskokwim up through the Yukon Delta up toward Norton Sound. And as we get further west, waves could be over 10 feet there in the vicinity of St. Matthew with southwesterly winds at 30 knots. On the north side of St. Lawrence Island and on the west side of the Seward Peninsula, we're looking at northerly winds as high as 15 to 25 knots. Northwest winds 15 to 20 knots through the lower Chukchi Sea on Friday. Westerly winds along the Arctic coast all the way down to Wainwright at 15 knots. And then for Saturday, we're looking for generally west-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots along the Arctic coast, waves 2 to 3 feet. But with that front approaching, winds southeasterly ahead of it, so Cape Lisburne, Point Hope, down to off Shishmaref, 25 to 30 knot winds through the lower Chukchi Sea with waves of 5 to 7 feet. And once we get south of the Bering Strait, southeast to south winds to 30 knots. And we could see waves running as high as 7 to near 10 feet then during the day on Saturday. And keep in mind there could be some higher water levels there along the coast, elevated water levels due to that increased surf action, especially around high tide.